Bonjour, Annie. Was kan ik nak dus nikas kahawai ke jung toji. Me cannot do them. My name is Phyllis Racette. My Indian name is White Turtle from the Turtle Clan. I'm from Ebenflow First Nation, Anishinaabe, Ojibwe. I speak my language, but today this story I'm going to tell in English. My husband and Larry Racette and I are doing a series of videos to retell the stories that were told to him by his grandfather, Jean Marie Racette of Ebenflow. Today I'm going to talk about Larry's first cousin, 4 generations back. He was a very special man because he is a very important man in the Racette family. Today I'm going to start off by talking about him and why he was very important to the Racette family. I have a picture of this man. This is a book that we created, a Racette family history book. And in some of the stories in here is a picture of George Racette. This is him. George was born in the Red River settlement in Winnipeg. Born Métis to a Métis family, George Racette Sr. and Francois Guibault. George had a wife, and her name was Marie Larocque, and they had 5 children together. George Racette's grandfather was Charles Racette, the French Canadian, who spent over 30 years in the Northwest Territories. His grandmother was called Cheman, and in our language it means something around sweet one. We know her in the research as Josette or Mother Racette. So those were George's grandparents. His grandfather was a French-Canadian fur trader who was in this area, and in later videos I'll talk about him. But today I'm going to talk about George. His grandmother was from the area around Oka, Quebec, in Montreal. And George grew up with the native way of life. He was a very proud man, George Racette. We know that now from the research because of how he dressed himself and how he conducted himself. And you'll begin to understand that some of the history that you hear or see online is inaccurate, of course, because of hearing a different perspective. So today I'm going to read from an article that was made by Lawrence Barkwell, a very prominent genealogist, researcher. And he talks about this man in this article. George Racette, Cheman, born circa 1821 to 1877. Cheman meaning canoe in our language. George was a Métis born at Red River. He was married to Marie Racette, born 1820. He was the son of George Sr., born at Fort Pelly in 1800, and Marie-François Guibault, both Métis. His nickname Cheman, or as it written here, Canoe Man in Soto, came from the fact that he moved around a great deal. He was a plains trader, a large man, well over 6 feet. George was a skilled hunter, fighter, and horseman. And it's well, when they talk about him, he was a very tall man. That's how Larry's father, Bonaparte Racette, he was very tall. Same with all of his brothers. They were very tall men. In 1873, George, with several others, established a council in the Qu'Appelle Valley with the intent of forming a government. Due to their lack of formal education, they sent for Louis Riel to assist them in this. And one of the things that I found in the research was that George was very instrumental in helping Native people. He carried a lot of people with him, warriors. He was married into Sioux families in the United States. But he didn't have education. And Louis Riel was his cousin. They knew each other really well. George was also present at the Treaty 4 negotiations. An unknown militia member described a Métis horseman at the Treaty 4 negotiations at Fort Qu'Appelle. On the first day of the assembly, almost immediately after the dress being sounded by Bugler Burns, the whole camp came forward in martial array, led by an enormously large man, riding a very fair specimen of the buffalo hunters of that time, standing about 16 hands high, dark brown, and showing a strain of good blood. His rider, attired in blue cloth capote and brass buttons, cotton shirt unstarched, moleskin trousers, and new deerskin moccasins with broad L'Assomption belt or sash of variegated colors and silk around his waist. Indian pad saddle with heavily beaded saddlecloth, complemented with the tout ensemble of this would-be leader, now riding well in advance, curvetting and ascribing circles and half-circles at the canter. Imagine this man, George Racette, a real showman for sure, and often wanted to show that even though he had a lack of education, he was a leader. He wore what he wore because he was very proud to be a Métis half-breed. And he was very, liked to tease the government to show them that the people still had the power. It is said that George wore that belt, and they call it Métis sash. That's what they call it now. And Métis of that day used that to show who they were. The story continues. Canter or lope, and now and then parading up and down the whole frontage until close up to our marquee tent. Then at a given signal, the soldiers of the party with their hawk's wings rode forward in sections and passed in review before him at a gallop towards the fort, and on their return circled around him in a single file, displaying some feats of horsemanship, while the rest of the camp were dismounted, awaiting further orders. Then came Hawkwing and Red Cloud, Cree chiefs. To continue the story, we believe that the man described in the passage above is George Cheman Racette. Born in 1819 at Red River in 1874, George represented the Assiniboine Indians at the Treaty 4 negotiations. His display of military strength and strong positions during negotiations led to his being overpowered and locked up during negotiations. He was only released when he promised to leave that area. That is one story of George Racette. We know there's many stories. Larry Racette and I, we researched this information for the last 10 years, and we've come to believe that George, his cousin 4 times removed, was the builder of the Thunderbird nest site across the lake here at the Narrows, just before the Narrows. And the story about George coming in with his horses and his riders, he had a lot of warriors that were on his side. And yet, if you know him as the way that Jean Racette talks about him, then you'll know a different side of the story. We all know that there's many sides to stories. And George Racette, also known as Cheman, had many sides to his story also. He was called Cheman, but Jean Racette also called him Thunderbird Man when he told Larry stories, or he would call him Papinet. That means to live through anything in our Ojibwe language. George was also called Shaman Racette in many of the things I've read. He was also known as a Indian witch doctor or a medicine man. They also called him showman. And I could just see that George liked to show off, coming in, riding in with all these horses and showing to the government that we still had power in this country. And also he was called Shuman, a word we know in our language as raisin. One of the things that was used for making alcohol was the raisin. So he was called Cheman probably for that reason. George Racette, not well liked because of his strong positions, but he was part of trying to create a government in Saskatchewan. And even though he didn't have or lacked the education, he was still a strong leader and had many that followed him. We're going to hear more stories about George Racette. Some of them will shed light on his behavior. If you know how his grandfather was, it's going to shed light on how he was. We believe that George Racette, had he lived longer, would have done great things, even more so. Thank you for listening to these to this story about George Racette Jr. And hope you join us in the next videos. Larry is also speaking about the things that his grandfather shared with him when he was a little boy. And me wet for listening.